and welcome to the podcast. It is very good to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
We have so much to talk about because you've got a lot of stuff that's come out this past spring.
Yeah.
And we should start with the most recent thing, which is Freedom, the fifth book in the F Word series. And before we get into that book, tell us a little bit about what the series is about for anyone who may not be familiar.
Well, so basically, I started the series in early 2017, when I was kind of going through a tough time, and I wanted to see characters that were reflecting the things that I needed to see, like, out there in the world, but I wasn't really seeing very often in MM. So I wrote Flaunt, which was a femme for femme story, where a femme cis guy meets a trans guy post-transition who wants to explore his femininity now, and they kind of help each other through that process, because that was exactly what I was working through at the time. And then in the process of writing that book, I accidentally made a found family, because I do this with all of my books. So it ends up being like about this group of guys who work at an HIV charity in LA. So I kind of saw the chance to continue the story and make it a series. So now the F Word books include like a gender fluid character, lots of femme guys, HIV positive guy. One of them has OCD, a pregnant trans man. So a really diverse cast of characters that I didn't see very much. And I think it's become known as my series with trans guys because there's at least one non-binary or trans main character in every single book. And 3 of them now have trans men in them.
I like that these diverse type of characters come forward in your stories because, as you said, you don't see as much of that. I think there's a little more now, but it's still an evolving sort of character type that we're seeing in MM.
Yeah. There wasn't very much in it in 2017 because my first trans book was actually July 2016, and that's when I wrote Grind, which was the last book in my Valley Brothers series, and a lot of people said that was the first trans book they'd read, and I went to look at other trans books, and there just wasn't that much out there, and I really kind of wanted to make a little bit of headway in introducing people to these characters, especially, and then at the same time, I was also noticing these other things that I wasn't really seeing very much. And I said, well, these are the sorts of people that I have around me in real life, so why wouldn't they also be in books?
Absolutely. To bring that representation forward is great so that everybody kind of sees themselves in a book.
Yeah.
What do you hear from readers as you expose them potentially to these types of characters for the first time? Because they may not know these people in real life at all.
Yeah, I think it's been really validating, I think, for me because I've seen such great feedback on them. I think in particular, there's a lot of parents who read the story and they either have a trans kid or they have friends, their kids have trans friends or whatnot. And this is something that none of us really grow up being taught. And so they don't have that language and they want to learn more. And I know, like, from my parents as well and from the people I know, one of the biggest worries that a lot of parents of trans kids have is that their kids are not going to be happy or healthy or safe or loved. Those are like the big 4 things. And I wanted to show characters being all of the above. So I've had a lot of tremendous feedback, which has been phenomenal, with people saying that they understand their kids better, or their kids' friends, or other people in their life, like in their workplace or in their schools or their siblings. And I think it's really important because it's over 80% of Americans don't know that they know a trans person personally, even though I think a lot of people might actually know a trans person. They might not be out, or they might be stealth, or they might be closeted or whatnot. So they don't have someone around them to kind of go, oh yeah, it's that this is something that's around me in everyday life. And so people want to seek out the fiction to find out more about it and to get sort of the inside perspective on it. And that's kind of the perspective that I approached writing the series as a whole and what inspired it, I guess.
How do you approach writing characters that are outside of your own life experience with some of those characters?
The same way I would say with pretty much any book, but with more caution. So starting off by recognizing where my experiences are similar and where they differ, especially when you get some of the bigger privileges that I have, like my whiteness, for example. A lot of black trans people, like black trans men and black trans women, might have more in common than white trans men and black trans men do because of that anti-blackness, for example. So I have to acknowledge where I've had bad experiences that would have been much worse if I didn't also have these other privileges. And I think that's a really important first step because a lot of us kind of assume, especially in the queer umbrella, that if you're queer, then you can kind of talk about everything that's queer. And that's not necessarily the case because we can have really vastly different experiences under the same umbrella. So I start off there and then I look for personal accounts. I talk to friends. I look for like online blogs and that kind of thing. I try not to sort of burden people with the one-on-one questions. I try to do that, the initial education myself. And then if I'm lucky enough to know somebody who fits into one of those groups, I can kind of bring the more advanced questions to them. But I try not to sort of be like, sit me down and explain all of this to me for free, please. Emotional labor that people do, and I end up having to do sometimes in my life. So I try not to put that on other people. And I also try to just get a range of stories, because I know this, like from my own marginalizations, for example, like there's a bunch of different ways that you could tell a trans story, which are all true. And they all fit within the range of a plausible life experience for people, but they might actually contradict each other. They might go down very vastly different paths. So I try to seek out like a range of voices of some people will have very different experiences when they face the same thing than other people. And I try to set my story. I don't know necessarily whether I set it sort of to one end or the other end of a spectrum or what's going on exactly, but I try to kind of see that things plausible before I go ahead and write them.
Mm-hmm. What kind of, I guess, extra time does that add to a book for you to take care of all those items wherever it falls within your writing process?
Not that much, actually, surprisingly. I think because I've put a lot of effort into this sort of work in my everyday life, like outside of writing a particular book. So I've taken a great deal of care over the last maybe 5 or 10 years-ish, since I kind of started to be exposed to more diverse people, and outside the sort of like tiny, white, small hometown that I spent some of my teen years in and so on, where these narratives just weren't getting through, I realized how much I didn't know, and I went and tried to seek out these things. So I've got, luckily, a pretty broad base of knowledge around a bunch of different things now, because I've spent so much time in, especially my late teens, early 20s, kind of seeking people out and listening and trying to figure out the privileges that I have, as well as my marginalizations. So when it comes to an individual story, I now have a little bit of a foundation, like I know where to go to look for more, where I think it takes a lot of time if you're at the beginning of that process, because you don't even know the language that you need to know to look up the things that you need to know. And like that is really slows you down as you try to figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. You don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about freedom. What's happening in this book?
Well, this particular book, I took two characters who kind of seem to have very opposite backgrounds, but they actually end up kind of having a lot in common. Both Henry and Jaden need to find freedom in their own way, and they help each other do that, which is kind of the underlying message in most of my books, really. I think it's a surprisingly joyful story because it's an F-word book, and that's one of my messages of the series. So Jaden has agoraphobia and he gets panic attacks, but he's been in therapy for quite some time and he's ready to push himself and to kind of take the next step and trying to get into the world. And he's getting a therapy dog, a service dog, sorry. And he's kind of at a stage in his life where he wants to sort of step out and push himself. And he's been really relying on his big brother, who actually in the beginning of the story pushes him a bit too far without his say-so. So he ends up having to kind of make those boundaries clear. And then Henry is a wilderness guide who's post-transition, and he hasn't dated since his final stage of bottom surgery, so he's a little bit nervous about dating, and he's really thrilled when the first date goes well. And kind of as part of that, but also as a result of where in his life he finds himself, he decides that he wants to come out of stealth mode, so that he kind of feels like he's in the closet all over again now. He wants to live openly as a trans guy, but he's kind of worried about telling his best friend and his boss, who are the people he's around the most, so he has to figure out how and when to disclose. So both of them are kind of in the same process of finding freedom, even it's in very different ways. And I think it's one of my best books. I'm really proud of it and how it came out. I love that I finally got to write a character who was post-phalloplasty, because that's really rare. Bottom surgery in general, with trans guys, is just not written about much. The two main types, meta and phallo, I've already written a post-meta character in blunt, but not phallo. So getting to write this was really rewarding, because there's so many myths out there and so few lived experiences about what it's actually like day to day. And so much of the information out there is just dry surgical statistics and complication rates and that kind of thing, not the actual experience of what it's like to live in this body. And so many people just don't think that it's possible to have a satisfactory result at all. And that's just not necessarily true. That's something that I got caught up in for years and years, because we're so locked into cis-normative ideals about bodies and about what trans people are supposed to want and how we're pressured into wanting to pass, and there's just no space for trans people to live. And I wanted to create that space, and I wanted trans guys to have that fantasy as well, because why shouldn't we get that fantasy too? Like, we can have the sex life of your dreams and the romantic partner of your dreams, and our books don't necessarily have to be about how there's always something missing and, that kind of thing. That's, I find, really disempowering.
Mm-hmm. That's power of, I think, the romance book is you get to write and show characters of all kinds having a full, rich life.
Hmm.
There
Yeah.
are always the problems that show up in a romance book because you've got to hit those beats,
Mm.
but they have a full, rich life.
Yeah, and you have some flexibility on what those beats are exactly. Because like when I started writing the F Word series, I was stealth, so that means I was living in my new identity without disclosing my gender history. And so it was one of my only outlets to really process what was happening to me, like not just the everyday experiences of being read as male and perceived as male and learning how to get around in the world as male, especially within the gay male sort of subculture. And then the deep stuff, like the compromises that I was having to make to get the medical treatment I needed. So I wanted that to sort of be in the books as this kind of constant background noise that we experience it as. But I didn't want to exploit those moments for narrative tension the same way that I've seen a lot of cis writers do, because I find it really awful when I see the big moments are always, outing or dead naming characters or, the boys don't cry, God help me, that film. That is sort of where we come from, and that's our only representation. So I wanted something different. So like stories that lift me up and show the possibilities of gender euphoria, not just dysphoria. And, just show not just fellow trans people, but also those who know and love us, like what life is like from the inside, where a lot of stories kind of talk about trans people using the language that we use to describe ourselves to cis people, which necessarily is going to be sort of simplistic, sort of 101, sort of relatable to cis people. But sometimes that language doesn't actually really reflect how we experience life at all. This is just sort of how we get other people to understand in their own way, where we have such a different sort of tapestry of things going on that we're worried about. So I wanted our books like to have that tapestry of things going on, but not be unrelatable or difficult to understand or whatnot. So it's a ton of work, but it's really rewarding to get to write those stories from the inside as both a mirror and a window.
And I love that analogy you just did, the mirror and the window.
Yeah, I
Uh,
don't know where I picked it up. I think it was on Twitter somewhere, but basically it was that diverse stories are either a mirror so that you can see yourself in the story, or if you're not one of the people in the story, it's a window so that you can see into another life. And I find that so powerful, and I want the stories to be both a mirror and a window, so it takes some crafting to try to make sure that they don't alienate one group or another, but it's really worthwhile.
mhm. It sounds like these might almost be like your almost favorite series to write because of what it does and the stories that it represents.
Hmm.
Not to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, I think so, actually. It's uniquely difficult to write in because I have to be in the right headspace. And Freedom actually started off as a short story 2 years ago, and I was going to immediately turn it into a novel because I knew that there was the rest of the story to tell. But at that point in my life, I just wasn't ready to do that, and I was also pre-surgery myself, so I felt like I didn't know the things that I needed to know to show, life on the other side yet. So it was only afterward, and then after I'd kind of dealt with all of the, healing and the any sort of surgery is trauma as well. So I had to kind of deal with all of that like life effect. And then I sat down and went, oh no, now I'm ready for this book. Like I think this book is something that I could only have written at this very specific moment in my life, but it's something that I needed to read 2 years ago. So it feels really important.
And now it'll be there for somebody else to find in the right
Exactly.
time.
Hmm.
Is there going to be more F word in the future, do you
Um,
think?
yeah, I think so. I have several ideas that I really want to pursue, but I just don't know when. I kind of have to wait till I'm in the right headspace for each story. And but I do want to keep telling stories about the other aspect I think of the F word books is not just that it's showing diverse characters and trans and non-binary in particular, but it's also telling very particular stories about what queer and trans community and found family can look like. And it's a sort of more queer community, I think, in F word, where it's more of a gay community in my other books, which is a distinction that I think it's a difficult one to explain, but I think it resonates with a lot of queer people out there. And so I really want to tell more stories like from that side of the fence of what that looks like, but I just don't know when yet.
Hmm. Hmm. And hopefully you won't run out of appropriate F words.
I have had that worry, but I have a long list.
Good. Moving over to another recent book that you've put out, you were part of the Rosavia Royals shared universe, and you wrote one called Barely Regal.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the universe in that book.
Rosavia Royals was such a satisfying series to work on. It was a dream because I've always wanted to develop a fictional European country with its own royal family and its etiquette and history and culture and the favorite foods that everybody's got and everything. Like all of that stuff is just so cool. And getting to do that in conjunction with a bunch of other really cool authors is just phenomenal. Getting to build the family relationships between the different princes was the best. So basically what we did was we created 5 fictional princes, and the oldest to the youngest, who are all in line for the Rosavian throne. They're all brothers, and then each of us took one of the brothers and wrote their book. So we had to work really closely together to develop this royal family and our own characters and crossover characters. So we have a lot of secondary characters and locations that show up in all the books, because they all happen in the same 2 weeks leading up to the royal ball in Rosavia. And at the royal ball, the oldest prince is expected to announce his engagement, even though he's kind of a playboy and the sort of irresponsible rebel heir. So all the other princes have this idea of him as being this really flighty, unreliable guy, but he's actually kind of got his own story too. And so you get to see his story and him kind of stepping into his responsibility. And then all the other guys reacting to their own circumstances. So for me, I chose Barely Regal, and it was the moment I saw the book. They actually started as book covers. We bought them as 5 pre-made book covers, and the moment I saw the cover, I was like, that one's mine. And I'm writing it, and the title is going to be Barely Legal, and the book just came out fully formed like that. I knew that I was going to choose the youngest prince and make him like the bratty youngest boy, and so just turned 19 and rebellious, and he doesn't see why his job, which is Commander of Roses, it just seems like this made-up thing, and he doesn't see why that's actually important to the royal family and their history anyway. And his valet was the obvious choice for the daddy that he winds up in a relationship with. So Tom has his own scars because he was used by a more powerful boy before, so he's quite slow to trust. He doesn't want to get into that situation again. So a lot of the book is kind of that slow evolution of their relationship, because they've known each other for a decade, and Tom sort of taming Ren, but I don't think he can ever really tame a brat. And always kind of knowing exactly what he needs and showing him, because he can kind of sense what Ren is looking for before Ren even knows himself. So yeah, I'm really proud of the series and what we achieved together, and I'm super excited because it's actually coming out in audio. It's already been recorded by Kieran Flitton, who recorded Helen Juliet's Royal books, and it's in review with Audible, so it could be out later this month or next month. It's up to Audible right now. The review times are
Any minute now, it'll be out.
This week, it could be next month, but I'm really excited because hearing it out loud was just like falling back into that universe all over again. I've kind of been living in for the last, really, since February, so it's kind of, I don't want to extract myself now. I just want to live in that world.
Yeah, living in a good royalty could be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it totally is.
So that came together quick. If you've been living in it since February, we're only in June. That sounds like that universe came together really quickly.
Yeah, we were really lucky because we found the pre-made covers, and both Helen and I, who had previously worked together on Men of Hidden Creek, happened to be awake at that time, happened to spot the covers, and messaged each other going, oh my god, you know what we need to do? Yes, I know. And so instantly we went, okay, shared universe, 5 authors, find 3 other people, and both of us happened to be available to write books. Like, we just tied up our last projects at that point, which I think I had just finished up Freedom and gotten it to the editor, and I was going, okay, what do I do next? And so we were available to just jump in, and so there was a case of messaging other people and finding out who was available, like right now, basically. And it was kind of one of those stars aligning situations that we managed to get Stella Sterling, Zoe Don, who's a debut author, and then Max Rowan, who used to write as Max Hawthorne, but had to change her name, who was in Men of Hidden Creek. So we managed to get her back as well, and we just got together what I feel like was the perfect combination of people to write each of those books at exactly the right moment, and we all just plunged in. And we really wanted to write them simultaneously because we beta read each other's books. That was really important to us, was working together as we went along to build in all those crossovers because they're so very tightly connected.
Working over a span of a 2-week story block in a small European island, it's all got to mesh together just right. That sounds like a lot of story Bible work.
It was. The story Bible was our absolute savior. We started it when I think I was the first one to start writing, and we started it right then and kept it updated the entire way through because there were so many moments of even just going, oh, I've got this thunderstorm happening on this Friday, so you've got to make sure that if you've got a scene happening on this Friday, there's a thunderstorm. There's really basic details. And we also had a phenomenal beta reader, Amy Patel, who works with Lescourt, was our absolute savior. The first book, and really all of the books, should be dedicated to her because she just kept us on track, and she kept track of all of those crossover moments and went, oh, if they're having this scene happening on this day, then these guys could actually be in the background. And like, she was so good with all these details. And I think every shared universe needs someone who's keeping track of that.
Yeah. Otherwise, it can just like, oh, I didn't know you did this over there. This one little moment that becomes, something that's screwed up somewhere else. Yeah. You need that continuity.
Yeah.
And wonderful, they're coming out on Audible.
Yeah, so we got all 5 of them in various stages of recording. A couple of them already submitted. So we're really hoping to get them out pretty quickly. We've been lucky enough to get the audiobook to the narrator ahead of time to try and really reduce that gap before the audio comes out.
Wonderful. I'm looking forward to that because I want to read these books. I love royal books and couples and all that stuff. And so that I look forward to binging them on audio. Now, speaking of binging, you also boxed up Significant Brothers.
Yes.
And it's all fully available in a box set of ebooks as well as audio.
Yeah, I'm really happy to share that. It's been a couple of years since those books went live, about 3 years since the first one went live, and I'm one of those collectors who needs to have everything in the same place myself, and it drives me nuts if I can't. And I only ever put Wintersweet, which is the follow-up novella, out on Amazon briefly as a 99-cent thing. But I'm really funny about putting things out that don't stand alone, and that book is a novella about the first guy's wedding, so it doesn't really stand alone. So I didn't really feel good leaving it out there. So I'm really happy to collect them all in one place. It's the entire universe is there in one box set, and I wanted to put it in KU for binge reading and on Audible for one credit. And it's just I think a nice place to dive in, especially if you haven't read my books before. I think it's a really good introduction to that sort of low angst, feel good, found family, all that kind of stuff that defines my books. You can find it there.
Mm-hmm. So this is like the trademark E. Davies book set.
Yeah, pretty much. I've only ever written basically, I started apart from 1 or 2 little experiments, pretty much all contemporary and romance. So I think the E. Davies book is feel good and low angst. I hear that a lot. Realistic yet optimistic, always steamy. And the guys always seem to kind of fit together and find this mutually supportive, uplifting way of being together. And even when I try to write angsty books like my After series, Afterburn, Afterglow, and Aftermath, or Redemption, I think those are probably the only books I have that I would call angsty, but they still end up kind of being the low angst versions of angst.
For those who don't know Significant Brothers, tell us a little bit about that series so people will know that they need to go pick this up.
So it's a series about 6 guys who were high school best friends, and the series title is actually one of my favorite parts about it. It's called Significant Brothers because they were all in high school together, and they'd all kind of found each other in high school, as queer kids tend to do, and flocked together, and they tried to go to the prom, except they were told, oh, you can't go to the prom unless you have a female date. You need to have a significant other. And they went, oh, well, what about Significant Brothers? And then that became their little friendship group name that stuck, and they stayed in touch, over the years as they all kind of grew up and they found unusual careers. So we've got a pilot and a race car driver and a zookeeper and a park ranger who used to be an astronaut and all these other kind of really cool careers that I had them going out to do. And then they've all kind of come back together now in their mid-20s as they kind of settle down a little bit in their hometown and find love. And I think it's a really kind of optimistic, sweet, low angst, sort of feel good ride through this universe. And each of the guys, they always show up in each other's books. So you kind of end up collecting them. And then by the time you get to book 6, you've got this huge collection of 12 dudes. And they're all in the background of each other's stories, which is really fun. And then the follow-up novella, Wintersweet, was about the first one's wedding. The last book in the series is Tremble, and that actually won the Rainbow Award for the best bisexual romance, which was fantastic. And yeah, it's, I think, a really good introduction to all things E. Davies.
Now, you love working with tropes.
Yes.
You've got the trope finder on your website, which we will link people to, because I think that is such a great way to categorize books on an author website. Do you have favorite tropes, or are you game to play with just anything?
I kind of would say just anything, because I just love the process of working with tropes and figuring out how to break a story down into tropes. I really love satisfying those expectations or subverting them and kind of playing with them. And I love unusual combinations and the tried and true. I think ultimately I'm just a total sucker for the cheesy and the camp and the unapologetic pleasure, what some people call guilty pleasure, but I don't believe in being guilty about it. I just believe in being unapologetic about it. So I any trope that really fits into that genre of unapologetic pleasure, feel good, low angst, I'm happy to work with. So I tend to find like a lot of opposites attract and a lot of small towns. I think small towns especially lend themselves really well to that found family feeling, and that's something that I just about everything I write ends up having a found family by the time I'm done the book, whether I mean to or not. It's kind of one of the foundations of queer life, really, found family, so I'm not surprised. That is like a quintessential gay romance trope, I think. I end up having a lot of hook-up to lovers as well, which is really true to the experiences that I see around me, like in my friendship groups and stuff as well. That feels like a really realistic thing. So yeah, I think a lot of the tropes are just inspired by what I see around me in everyday life and what I sort of aspire to see, like the optimistic, happy endings.
What do you think are the two most, I guess I'll say, opposite tropes that you've ever put together and had it work out?
After like 45 books, you're straining my memory here. Let me just look on the table behind me. I have some books out ready to be mailed here. Actually, I think Forever, which was my trans pregnancy romance, because I wanted to have a closeted sort of out-for-you-ish story and surprise pregnancy. And I think just in general doesn't expect surprise pregnancy to be a trope unless you're within MPreg. And I really wanted to play with that. I wanted to show what can actually happen, again, with sort of realistic trans lives. But I also didn't want the pregnancy to be forced upon him because I feel very strongly about that. And that's it could be used as a very sort of struggle, sort of trauma porn almost for trans characters. And a lot of trans guys wouldn't feel great about surprisingly being pregnant. So I wanted this to be a character who does actually want to have a child, but he just gets pregnant earlier than he expected. And he has to kind of rush to get his life together where he thought he had more time. And then I put that together with the Gay For You story because the two of them had met before. And it's just sort of second chances as well because they didn't hook up the last time they met, but then this time they managed to get to. And then, things happen and they end up having to deal with them. And I think I think it came together perfectly because those tropes supported each other so well, actually. But they weren't, I think, tropes that you would expect to see together.
Right. I mean, about the closest you get in MM to a baby is a secret baby because something happened in the past before the story started, perhaps.
Yeah, or you get like somebody might have a child already and, they've gotten divorced or whatnot and they end up kind of getting into a relationship with someone else. But I haven't really seen a romance that was driven by the main character getting pregnant by the other main character and then them figuring out, oh, what do we do about this? I think that is something that happens in everyday trans lives and it happened for a very, very long time. It's nothing new or shocking. You've got all these news articles about like the first pregnant trans man, and there have been like at least 3 first pregnant trans men in the UK, according to the headlines. But it's been happening forever, and it's just not happening in books. So therefore, I wrote Forever.
What got you started in MM romance?
Well, I kind of grew up looking for gay books in the bookstore, and I didn't really know why. I wasn't sure why I was connecting so strongly to gay men, because I was denied that language to even understand my own identity until I was 20. But I was still seeking them out anyway, and they just weren't out there. There were like 3 books that were out there, and that was it, and nothing that really reflected my experiences, so I assumed they didn't exist, and I kind of gave up on looking. And then when I was on Amazon in 2013, I found gay erotica stories, and I went, oh, this is where they're all hiding, on Amazon, okay. And so I sat down immediately that day, and I finished an erotic short story that I kind of had half done on my hard drive and published it. And then I did another, and then I did about 40 more. And then I realized I kept writing romances and not erotica, and happy ever after endings. And that wasn't what people really wanted from erotica, so I was like, why not switch to romance? And I started to write romance novels instead. And now I'm up to about, I think, Barely Legal is number 45, and it just never
Congratulations, that's an awesome number.
Thank you. It's been kind of overwhelming, but also just fantastic to get to live out all of these different lives and tell all of these different stories. And I feel really strongly about romance in particular because it guarantees the happy endings that we've been denied for so long. And I want these stories to reflect the life that I've experienced and my queer community and the friends around me, but not sort of get bogged down in those mandatory sad endings and give people hope. And I'm tired of stories where we have to suffer for being gay and trans and we have to wrestle internally and hate ourselves and go through all of that angst and whatnot, because I see the damage that causes, and I'm in the community watching the ripple effect of people hurting people because of all of that stuff. And I'm basically, in my personal life and in books, I'm done with queer angst. So I was like, I'm just going to keep writing safe, low angst, happy endings over and over again. And I feel like that's helping tip the scales in my own tiny way, just a little bit, the way that I needed them to be.
Absolutely. I feel that same way. I want to write the world as I kind of want it to be more
Hmm.
than it actually may be. Have you always been a writer? You mentioned having like these stories on your hard drive sitting there.
Yeah, basically since I was like 6 or 7, I had this like little manila notebook at my parents' house of me writing a story about my betta fish, and I illustrated it as well. That was me like getting started with short stories. And then I kind of lost touch with it a little bit when I was in university because I was doing an English degree and I had to do all of the like literary analysis and all that kind of stuff. And that really took me out of the sort of fun and pleasure of genre fiction and into the now analyze the color of the curtains style of writing. And so it took me some time to kind of like get out of that mindset again. And then, yeah, basically that was right about the same time I graduated in 2013. And then it was that September that I found my first short stories on Amazon and started to write them and just sort of plunged in and never looked back.
It's wonderful. Give us a book recommendation. What's like the last book that you read that you're just crazy about?
So Ellen Gregory, she just re-released I Like His Two Bees, which is this little short story historical. So I'm rereading that later, actually, as my treat for like packing up a million books and shipping them overseas, and I don't do this to myself. But I did buy it thinking of the title, I admit, and I'm like famously, I love bees. But I was kind of hoping there'd be like a beekeeper, but I was actually really happy with what I found instead. It's this really lovely, gentle historical story, and it has all of these gorgeous scene-setting details and really tasty food. And I am a sucker for really tasty food, I've discovered recently. So it really makes it sort of spring to life. But the only thing I'm unhappy about is the fact that it's like a short story and it's not this entire series, because I wish you would write a whole series in that world. It's just this lovely little place to live for an afternoon.
Nice. So what's coming up next for you?
Well, actually, funny you should mention that, because I'm thinking about a story that involves food, and I'm actually, like, at the moment, I'm actually writing my first non-romance book. So after these dozens of romance books, it's this really strange experience, but it's trans nonfiction, but it's going to be a while before that's ready, because I'm considering publishing, like, traditional publishing, so it's going to take some time to get done and shop around and decide if I want to trad pub or self-publish and whatnot. So in the interest of publishing another book this year, I'm putting it back on the back burner again in July, and I'm kind of getting back to romance. So I currently have 3 standalones that are either planned or in progress. I think I'm going to do them before I dive back into series. But the first one is another sort of DS daddy boy dynamic book, because so many people have said how much they enjoyed Barely Legal, and I didn't quite get it out of my system. I think I still have some more story to tell in that dynamic. So that's the book that's going to involve both food and daddies. So that seems like a really good combination. I think that's going to be my next book out, but it probably won't be until like August, September-ish. And then I'm going to follow that up with a couple more standalones that I've been wanting to write, but I've been kind of finishing off series for the last year or so.
Is there anything you could share more about the nonfiction? You piqued my curiosity there.
Well, basically, I wanted to write a story about the surgery process that I've been through, about sort of the questions that I wanted to know answers to that I couldn't find answers to anywhere. I've been doing some of that work in my fiction books by kind of giving people fictional representations, but I've got all these really interesting stories about this journey to surgery, and like it's a book about my dick is how I've been describing it to my friends. But it's also all of these little moments about how it's not like it is a huge life-changing surgery, but it's the process you have to go on before you get to that point that's the more important thing. And I think that hints at a lot of the stuff I've seen. Like I recently watched the documentary Disclosure, and it was all about, there's a section about how interviewers had to focus on the surgery as like the big thing about us. But it's always done from a very cis viewpoint of like this one big thing that you go through and that's it. And that's what defines you, whether you're a man or a woman, blah, blah, blah. And like my process of going through that just broke all of those things to smithereens. So I kind of wanted to write about the funny side of life, the joyous side of life, the interesting things that happen, the truth is stranger than fiction, I think, side of it, as well as sort of showing trans men who are looking at surgery that it's a huge surgery, but it's not the scary sort of it's not the surgery that it was in the 80s or the 90s, because a lot of the myths that are persisting now, because of the stuff that used to happen back then, and a lot of the policing that kind of happens of what we're allowed to want and what we feel like this will result in, is very transphobic, and it's really steeped in these sentiments of what we're supposed to want. And I kind of want to write this like joyful, tongue-in-cheek, lighthearted, fun book, actually. And yeah, we'll see how it ends up taking shape, but that's the general ballpark I'm writing in. And then if I end up working with a publishing house, I'll see how they want me to shape it, and we'll go from there.
It's really excellent, I think, that you're doing that. I mean, I have obviously no lens in that space at all, but just hearing you talk about that it's a book you wish you kind of had means that there's other people out there who need that book really desperately.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it was only like a year ago that I was having the surgery, and then like the months leading up to it, I was talking to my boyfriend at the time and saying how like scared I was and how uncertain I was, even though I was sure I wanted it, but I was uncertain about the results, and I just couldn't find that many sort of stories about what it was like to like afterward, or what it was like to go through it. There's so much stuff that I had to join these like secret surgery groups and sort of interpret people's posts, and so much stuff that just didn't make sense to me until I actually went through the process and went, oh, if someone had warned me about this, I might have like transferred all of my soup tins into like Tupperware containers I can open one-handed, because I found myself like after surgery not being able to use one arm, like wedging the corner of my soup tin in my sink trying to open it one-handed and stuff, like all of these crazy little things that nobody had really warned me and I didn't really think about, but I wish that I had been able to. And as well, I thought the bigger thing, like how is it going to affect your sex life? Like so many people think, oh well, that's it, like you just won't feel sensation anymore ever, and that's not true anymore necessarily. There are good surgeons out there who have microsurgery teams who can do wonders, and we need to have higher expectations, and we need to like join together as a community to demand those expectations, not just kind of accept what's out there because it's their only choice, because it isn't anymore. And I feel quite strongly we should be talking about having high expectations and how we can best maximize our aftercare, and how to talk to surgeons about what we want. Because surgeons, like, how do they, Juno Roche wrote this in Trans Power, like, how do surgeons decide what we want? Like, where do they decide that the ideal dick comes from? Like, are they watching porn? Is it based on their dick? Is it based on, like, if you actually think about that, like, how does that happen? Because I know from my point of view, I didn't get to walk in and say, well, this is what I want. They basically decided what I'm going to be given. So where does that come from? Like, how do we have conversations with surgeons, like, about whether the individual is more concerned about, quote unquote, passing, or about standing to pee, or about sexual sensation, or about like the erectile device, or preserving original anatomy? Like all of these things are actually options. They're not mandatory. Like you don't actually have to go down this very prescribed, strict path anymore. But there's still people who are kind of being forced down that path because the surgeons they work with or the information sources that they have say you have to get this, 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 and this, and this. That's not true anymore. I want options for all of us. I want us to know what we can get and seek that out.
I hope you get this book out soon, because I can see it being really important to be out there.
Yeah, I think it is. So I'm quite passionate about that, but that's kind of a back burner project again. It's quite difficult to kind of figure out what I want to say, how I want to say it, and how personal I'm going to get, because there's a, everyone's story involves real life and other people in their lives, and how much of that I want to include and all that kind of stuff is difficult to figure out. But I think there's a lot of value in being vulnerable, even though it does mean being vulnerable on a scale I haven't been before, because in my fiction, there's that lens, or that sort of wall of fiction versus nonfiction, and everyone understands. You might share experiences with the character, but not necessarily all of them. Whereas when you're writing nonfiction, like that's it, that's your life out there. So it's very different. I found as soon as I started sat down to write this, I went, oh wow, this feels really vulnerable, and I've got a lot to work through in terms of figuring out how to choose my tone for this, and how to construct even every individual chapter.
I look forward to hearing more about this as you keep going with it. How can people keep up with you online, learn what fiction comes next, how the nonfiction project is progressing, and all that stuff?
The best way is to join my Facebook group, which is called Ed's Petals. I post flower and bee photos, and I try to keep it like this lovely little low-stress bubble. That's the only place that I've really been talking about this nonfiction project. And I also post like my new releases and sales and stuff in there. And the other place that it's best to find out more is my newsletter, which is on my website, edaviesbooks.com. That's where I send out like my freebies and deals and new release alerts and all that kind of stuff. You can subscribe on BookBub and Amazon, but they can be kind of hit and miss on sending out actual notifications and stuff. So my newsletter or the Facebook group is definitely the best place.
Perfect. We'll link up to all those, plus all the books that we talked about. Ed, thank you so much for being here. It has been just wonderful talking to you.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you too. Thank you for having me.